What are the central lessons from the way innovation has spread in the kind of West Coast Silicon Valley world that Washington needs to hear about and maybe isn't coming through as much?
Sure. So I spent all my time in software internet universe, and there's been a real resurgence of early stage software internet entrepreneurship in the last 2 or 3 years. Sort of started in mid 2000s, with O'Reilly's Web 2.0 and sort of the boom that built around that. But I think what you've got is a lot of young first-time entrepreneurs who are very excited about being entrepreneurs, linked to a lot of very experienced, successful entrepreneurs, angel investors, venture capitalists who are actively participating in that innovation economy very aggressively. And one of the things that's very notable to me when I sort of watch DC and think about, interact with my friends in DC, is the difference between the notion of a startup and the notion of a small business, and the velocity of growth and activity associated with one of these startups versus a typical small business. You hear, coming out of Washington all the time, this notion of small business. We need to reinvigorate small business. We need the banking industry to support small business. Most of those things have nothing to do with the actual activity of startups and the growth curve and the job creation that these types of entrepreneurial startups have.
So in terms of how government, and goes from people who are working in the regulatory realm to working in agencies to working in Congress and on down, in terms of how to think about actually incubating innovation, which is something familiar to venture capitalists. What are the policies that are hindering some of that growth? What are the potential ways that it could be spurred, something that there is genuinely interest here in?
So I think the first thing that's critical is that people in government that want to be engaged with innovation and innovative companies, the first thing they need to do is understand what a high-growth company looks like and what a high-growth company does and needs relative to what is certainly a good thing in a small business or a slower growth company, but is a very different tempo of creation. There's a sort of cliche in the technology business is that there's a role that a lot of people have in business called corporate development. And there's usually one or more people in those companies whose job, sort of these high growth companies, is the job of corporate not development. So their job is to kind of protect the company from all the other noise in the system. Interestingly, if you flip that around in the context of government, a lot of government is essentially an inhibitor of this type of growth. And historically, I think most high-growth entrepreneurial companies, especially in their nascent form, let's say from the first couple of people with an idea up to 1,000 employees, which by the way could happen in 2 or 3 years. It doesn't have to be something that takes 15, 20 years to create. Most of those companies are sort of don't pay any attention to government other than I've got to conform with these regs, I've got to file this thing, I've got to pay this tax, I've got to do this whatever. They don't get any real benefit from the government in a direct form in terms of their innovation curve. And I think in many of those companies, their view is, and much of that sort of innovation economy, their view is the government may be a good customer, and in certain sectors, in certain places, the government is a good customer, whether it's state, local, or federal. But in other cases, it's just an impediment to actual real progress.
So one of the things that, looking back at the boom and the dot-com era, before Web 2.0, was this influx of technically talented people from abroad. And you can see that there's still that influx of people coming here to get educated, but there's a sense that maybe few of them are staying now. What are the incentives that government needs to think in terms of fostering this place as the spot to come in and start a business and really grow it into something that creates a lot of value and a lot of jobs?
I think the baseline starting point that people in government need to realize is that the U.S. is viewed as the best place to be an entrepreneur in the world, and continues to be viewed as the best entrepreneurial place in the world. Part of that is built on immigrant entrepreneurs. And if you look at Silicon Valley and you look at not just the last 10 years in pre-internet bubble, but you go back to the 1960s, 1970s, 1980s, the enormous number of companies created by first-generation American entrepreneurs and second-generation American entrepreneurs, children of immigrants, that created very, very significant technology companies. I mean, many of the household names of companies, that you go on the list of have one or more immigrant entrepreneurs as co-founders of those companies, and in some cases still leaders. Something changed in the last decade. Some of it's around immigration policy for sure, but some of it is also just tone of this sort of sense that it became harder in the U.S. to come into the U.S. if you want to start a company here. If you're an entrepreneur from outside the U.S. and you want to start a company in the U.S., it's extremely hard to get a visa to start that company. If you're a grad student or an undergrad, or a PhD, it's very difficult to get the appropriate visa to stay in the U.S. And start a company. That's combined with this notion that there are entrepreneurial communities growing like crazy all over the world. The sort of tenor and tempo of entrepreneurship that was created in the U.S. has been exported by many of these smart people, both the immigrants that came here that wanted to go back to their countries and spread that entrepreneurship. They're still Americans, but they're very much motivated to try to help improve where they grew up. And in other cases, just sort of the natural flow of information and talent. The web democratizes the world. And so you have information is available anywhere, that people have access to a computer and the web. So I think what's happened in the last decade is a combination of whatever our sort of views around immigration and tempo around immigration policy at a macro level are, really causes a huge stress on the system in terms of entrepreneurs and entrepreneurial innovation from other countries. I think that's a huge mistake, and it's essentially the same kind of mistake that underinvesting in education is in this country. Because what you want in the U.S. is you want the smartest, brightest, most innovative, most creative people to have easy access and easy ways to come into this country and do their great things here.
So how do you fix that?
Well, thanks for the setup. I mean, there's a handful of ways to fix it. One of the things that I've been involved in with a number of other entrepreneurs, angel investors, and venture capitalists is something we've called the Startup Visa. We've got a website at startupvisa.com. And the idea came about a year ago from a program that I'm a co-founder of called Techstars that has 4 programs a year now that are mentor-driven accelerators. So we have young entrepreneurs, first-time entrepreneurs come through this program, 90 days, they get a little bit of funding, they come out of the program and they start a company. Usually they've started the company coming into the program, but now they're really ready to launch the company coming out of the program. And it's 10 in each city, 4 times a year. Boston, Boulder, New York, and Seattle are the 4 cities. 2 years ago in Boulder, 2 of the 10 companies had immigrant founders. And they were both here on different types of visas. One was a visitor visa, one was an education visa type. And in both cases, we spent the summer trying to figure out how to get each of the founders of these 2 separate companies permanent residency or visas that would allow them to stay here in the U.S. and start their companies. And we weren't able to in either case with any sort of certainty in a relatively short period of time. One of the companies, the founders went back to Canada, raised money in Canada. Canadians are very dangerous people too, by the way. They can drink a lot of
I heard about that in Canadian bacon.
Yeah, they're really scary. So why we would want to push them out of the country, I've never quite understood. And then on the other side of that equation, we had 2 kids from the UK. And in both cases, I mean, immigration lawyers said, "Oh, no, you can use this type of visa, or you can get around the rules this way." Well, actually, no. It's much harder to do. It costs money. It takes time, and money and time are the 2 things that most startups don't have. And so it's not okay to wait a year to go through some sort of process to get your company started. So the other company went back to the UK. Ended up getting funding, hired a U.S.-based president, and now almost a year later, the entrepreneurs are able to get back visas to come back to the country. That inspired us to start this initiative called the Startup Visa, where the idea is that if you're a foreign entrepreneur and you want to start a company in the U.S. and you're able to raise a modest amount of capital from a qualified angel investor or venture capital investor, you get a visa called a Startup Visa. It turns out we're not creating any new visas either. There's a category called the EB-5 which is a visa that is almost the opposite of what the startup visa is intended to be. The EB-5 is a visa that if you're a foreigner and you invest $1 million in a U.S. company, you can get a visa. So we don't really want from our standpoint, that's nice, but that's not really where the power of the innovation comes from, the investor. The power of the innovation comes from the entrepreneur. So we want to create a visa ability for the entrepreneur to come in. So the startup visa that's been proposed, and is a bill in the House and a bill in Congress at this point, or in the Senate, shares the allocation with the EB-5 visa. So the EB-5 is underused. We're not actually proposing to create additional visas. We're just saying let's use the ones that exist, but let's use it for job creation, for innovation, for these entrepreneurs who are great entrepreneurs who have difficulty in it. Now, granted, that doesn't solve the whole problem. It solves one small part of it. I mean, you still have the problem, for example, of every student that gets a science technology degree, graduate students, that want to start companies or want to stay here. And don't want to be part of, for example, another large company and have to sort of go through the H-1B process. I mean, it's very difficult for those students.
Sure, it goes to the Tom Friedman's famous idea of stamping a green card to every doctorate or every professional degree in engineering. Would make sense to.
Awesome that Tom gets credit for that.
Well, he's articulated that in a clear way, although I think as in many ways, as he often does, he's taken a lot of other ideas and synthesized them into something on this platform.
I'm glad it's out there and it's loud.
Yeah. Well, again, thank you for coming by to talk. I know you'll be speaking at the summit tomorrow on Startup Visa.
Yep.
And look forward to seeing you online.
Thanks.